Emma Carter buried her husband at sunrise, and by midnight, a horse was screaming her name into the dark. Not neighing, not whinnying, screaming the kind of sound that came from something that understood grief. She ran barefoot across the yard, in her morning dress, her aunt shouting behind her to stop, to leave the cursed animal be. But Emma didn't stop. Because the horse wasn't looking at the barn. He was looking at her dead grandmother's window. And he had been looking at it every night for 2 years. Before we go further, if stories like this move, you hit subscribe and stay with me till the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The dirt was still soft over Daniel's grave when Emma Carter heard the horse scream for the first time. She had been kneeling in the little fenced plot behind the chapel, her black dress soaked through with sweat from the Wyoming summer heat. Her hands pressed flat against the mound of earth, like she could hold him there, like grief was something you could pin down if you just pressed hard enough. The preacher had said his words. The neighbors had said theirs. Her aunt had said, "It's done now, Emma. Come inside." And Emma had nodded, because that was what you did. You nodded, and you stood, and you let them lead you back to a house that didn't feel like home anymore. She hadn't expected the scream. It tore across the ranch just after midnight, raw and high and wrong, the kind of sound that made the hair on her arms stand up before her mind even understood what it was hearing. Not a dog, not a coyote. Something bigger, something in pain. Emma. Her Aunt Margaret Whitmore stood in the doorway of her bedroom, a lamp trembling in her hand, her nightcap askew. "Emma, stay put. That's coming from the north pasture." "That's Phantom," Emma said. "That's an animal Travis should have put down a year ago." Emma was already pulling her boots on over bare feet, her nightdress catching on the doorframe as she pushed past her aunt. "Emma, Louise Carter, you will not go out there in the dark." "He's screaming. Aunt Margaret, something's wrong." "Something's always wrong with that horse. That's what wrong looks like. You don't go running toward a broken animal in the middle of the night, you let Travis handle it in the morning." But Emma was already down the stairs, already out the door, the screen banging shut behind her, hard enough to wake the chickens. The night air hit her like cold water, after the stuffy grief of the house, and she ran her nightdress whipping around her ankles toward the sound that hadn't stopped, that seemed to be getting worse, more desperate. She found him at the fence line, silver gray and enormous in the moonlight. His sides, heaving, his eyes wide and white-rimmed, with something that looked, God help her, like sorrow. He wasn't hurt. She could see that even in the dark, no blood, no broken leg twisted beneath him. He was simply standing there, screaming up at the house, at a single dark window on the second floor. The window of the room nobody was allowed to open. Her grandmother's room. Isabella Carter had been dead 2 years, and her room had sat locked since the day they buried her, curtains drawn, dust settling over furniture. Nobody touched. And Phantom the horse. Nobody wanted the horse. Travis Boone called a lost cause, a devil, a waste of good grain, was standing at the fence at midnight, screaming up at that window, like he was calling to someone inside it. "Hey." Emma's voice came out softer than she meant it to. She climbed over the low rail, ignoring the way the wood scraped her palm raw. "Hey, easy now, easy." The horse's scream cut off mid-breath. His head swung toward her ears, pinned flat nostrils flared wide enough that she could see the pink inside them in the moonlight. For one long moment she thought he might bolt, might trample her into the dirt the way Travis always swore he would if given half a chance. Instead, he went still. Not calm, not gentle. Still the way a held breath is still the way a man goes quiet right before he says something that matters. "What is it?" Emma whispered. "What are you looking at?" The horse didn't answer, of course. Horses didn't answer. But his gaze didn't leave that window, not even when she stepped closer. Not even when her aunt's voice came sharp and furious from the porch, ordering her back inside before she got herself killed. "Emma Louise, you get away from that animal this instant." "He's not going to hurt me." He hurt Sam Cutler's boy just last spring, tore clean through a stall door. He was cornered. Emma didn't take her eyes off Phantom. Travis had him roped, and he was cornered. That's different. It is not different. It is a horse that should have been sold off or shot a year ago, and I will not have my niece, my only living family, killed by a beast that ought to be put down out of mercy. He's looking at Grandma's window, Aunt Margaret. That stopped her. Emma heard it the way her aunt's angry footsteps on the porch just stopped. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch, broken only by the horse's slow, ragged breathing, and the crickets starting up again now that the screaming had ended. "That's superstitious nonsense," Margaret said finally, but her voice had lost its fire. "Horses don't remember windows." "Then why does he do it every night?" "He does not do it every night. He does," Emma said, and she realized as she said it that it was true, that she'd noticed it a dozen times over the past months and simply hadn't let herself think about what it meant. Every night around midnight, if she woke and grief made her wake, often made sleep a stranger these past weeks, since Daniel, she'd hear him out there. Not always screaming like tonight. Sometimes just standing silent and staring a pale shape in the dark, aimed up at that one window, like a compass needle that couldn't point anywhere else. "Come inside." Margaret said quieter now, and there was something underneath the command that Emma hadn't heard from her aunt in a long time, something almost like fear. "Please, Emma, it's late. You buried your husband today. You need rest, not this." Emma looked back at the horse one more time. His eyes were still fixed on the window, but the wildness had gone out of him, replaced by something heavier, something that looked absurd as it was to think it of an animal like mourning. "I'll come in," she said. "But somebody needs to tell me why that horse won't stop looking at a room that's been empty for 2 years. Same. Nobody told her. Not that night, and not for 3 days after, though Emma asked. She asked Margaret over breakfast, over supper, in the quiet hours when the housework was done and there was nothing left to do but sit with the ache of a house too big and too empty. Margaret's answers were always the same: a tightening of the jaw, a change of subject, a firm, "That horse is none of your concern, Emma. You have enough to carry." She asked Hank Miller, the ranch manager, who'd worked the Carter land since before Emma was born. A man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen every kind of trouble a horse ranch could throw at a person. "Ma'am?" Hank said, turning his hat over in his hands, the way he did when he was choosing words carefully. "That horse came to us strange, and he stayed strange. I don't rightly know why he does what he does. But I'll tell you this much. Travis wants him gone, and your aunt's about ready to let him have his way." "Gone how?" Hank didn't answer that either. He just looked at her with something like pity and touched the brim of his hat and walked off toward the barn like a man who'd already said more than he meant to. It was Travis Boone who finally gave her a straight answer, though not the kind she wanted. She found him in the round pen behind the main barn on the 4th morning, a coiled rope in one hand, his shirt already dark with sweat, though the sun had barely cleared the ridge. Phantom stood pinned in the far corner of the pen sides, trembling, one eye rolled back white with fear. "Get away from him," Emma said before she'd even decided to say it. Travis didn't turn around right away. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of easy confidence that came from believing his way was the only way. "Morning, Mrs. Carter. Didn't expect you up this early?" "I asked you to get away from him." Now he turned, and there was something almost amused in the look he gave her, the way a man looks at a child who's said something cute but foolish. "This ain't a parlor visit, ma'am. This is work. This horse needs breaking, and breaking's what I do." "He's not a wild Mustang, Travis. He's terrified. Same thing way I see it." He coiled the rope tighter around his fist. "Animal don't respect you till it fears you. That's the way it's always been done, and the way it'll keep being done long as I'm the one doing the training on this ranch. My grandmother never trained a horse that way." Something flickered across Travis's face at that fast gone almost before Emma caught it, but she caught it all the same. Not quite anger. Something closer to unease. "Your grandmother," he said slowly, "had her own notions about that animal. Notions that got her exactly nowhere, if you don't mind me saying so, because he's stood in that pasture for 2 years, unbroke and unrideable and unsellable, and every day he eats grain that could go to a horse worth something. He's worth something. He's worth the price of a bullet is what your aunt and I have discussed. Travis said it flat, like he was talking about the weather, like he hadn't just driven a blade straight through Emma's chest. Kinder than letting him rot out there another 2 years screaming at windows and scaring off buyers. You can't. It ain't up to you, ma'am. Begging your pardon. His eyes flicked over her, taking in the black dress she still hadn't taken off 3 days after the funeral, because taking it off felt like something she wasn't ready for. Your aunt holds the deed till the estate's settled proper, and your aunt's about done with this horse's foolishness. Emma felt something rise up in her chest that she hadn't felt in weeks. Not grief, not the dull gray fog she'd been living inside, since Daniel's heart gave out in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon so sudden and so wrong that she still sometimes turned to tell him something before remembering. This was sharper, hotter. "Then I'll talk to my aunt," she said. "You do that." Travis turned back to the horse rope loosening in his grip like a thread all its own. "But you'd best hurry, Mrs. Carter. I aim to have this business settled by week's end." She found Margaret in the kitchen, elbow deep in bread dough flour, dusting her forearms and the front of her apron. The morning light came thin and gray through the window, and for a moment Emma just stood in the doorway, looking at her aunt's tired face. The lines around her eyes that had deepened since Isabella died, since the ranch's fortunes had started their slow, quiet slide. "Travis says you mean to shoot Phantom." Margaret's hands stilled on the dough. She didn't look up. "Travis talks too much." "Is it true?" "It's a decision that needs making, Emma. We can't keep feeding an animal that brings us nothing but trouble and expense." "He's not nothing but trouble. He tore through a stall door and put a boy in bed for a week. He's frightened off 2 buyers who came to look at the Morgan stock. He screams at the house half the night, so nobody sleeps proper, and now—" Margaret's voice caught just slightly, just enough for Emma to hear the crack underneath it. "And now you're out there in your nightdress at midnight, 3 days after burying your husband, climbing fences to comfort a beast that's more likely to kill you than comfort you back. He's not going to hurt me. You don't know that. I know he's looking at Grandma's window, Aunt Margaret, and I know that's not nothing, and I know you know it too, because you won't look me in the eye when I bring it up." The kitchen went quiet, except for the low crackle of the stove. Margaret's hands had gone still on the dough flour caked between her fingers, and when she finally looked up, there was something in her face Emma had never seen there before. Not sternness. Not the brisk, no-nonsense practicality that had carried the ranch through 2 hard winters and a husband's death and now a niece's widowhood. Fear. "Your grandmother kept things from us," Margaret said finally low, like the words cost her something to say. "Things about that horse. Things about where he came from and why she wanted him kept no matter what it cost her. I don't know all of it. She died before she finished telling me and what she left behind." She stopped herself, pressed her floured knuckles to her mouth for a moment. "It doesn't matter now. She's gone. The horse is a liability we can't afford, and grief makes people see meaning in things that don't have any. That's all this is, Emma. Grief looking for a window to stare at because it's easier than looking at an empty bed." The words landed harder than Emma expected, sharp enough to steal her breath for a moment. Because there was truth buried in them, she knew that new grief could twist a person's sight, make ghosts out of shadows, and messages out of silence. But there was something else buried in her aunt's words too, something Margaret hadn't meant to say. "What did Grandma leave behind?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "Nothing that concerns you. She was my grandmother. She raised me after Mama died. If she left something, she left a locked room and a horse that won't stop screaming, and a ranch half buried in debt. That's what she left, Emma, and none of it is going to be solved by you playing at mysteries instead of grieving the husband you actually lost." Margaret's voice broke fully on the last word, and she turned away fast back to the bread dough shoulders, shaking just slightly, with something she was working hard to hold in. Emma stood there a long moment, her own throat tight torn between the urge to go to her aunt and the fire still burning in her chest over Travis and his rope and his talk of bullets. "I'm not going to let him kill that horse," she said quietly. Then you'd best find a way to stop it, Margaret said without turning around. Because I am tired, Emma. I am tired of carrying this ranch on my own with a foreman who thinks cruelty is discipline, and a herd that keeps shrinking, and a niece who's more interested in a dead woman's secrets than her own future. Do what you need to do, but do it fast. Travis isn't a patient man, and neither, God forgive me, am I. She went to Phantom that evening, once the ranch had gone quiet, once Travis had ridden out to check the fence lines, and Margaret had retreated to her room with a headache and a cold cloth over her eyes. Emma carried nothing with her, no rope, no grain, nothing that looked like a tool for taming. Just herself, in a plain gray dress now, instead of mourning black, sitting down in the dirt outside the pasture fence with her back against the rail. Phantom watched her from 30 feet away, ears swiveling. Weight shifted onto his back legs like he might bolt at any moment. I'm not here to break you, Emma said quiet, not looking directly at him. I don't know what happened to you before you came here. I don't know why you look at that window, but I know what it is to lose something and not have any words big enough for it. The horse didn't move closer, but he didn't move away either. My husband died 3 weeks ago, she said, and it was the first time she'd said it out loud to anyone, plain and unadorned, no softening. His heart just stopped, in the middle of a Tuesday. He was fixing the pump handle, and then he wasn't fixing anything anymore. He was just gone, and I keep waiting to wake up from it, and I don't wake up because it isn't a dream, it's just what happened. Phantom's ears flicked toward her. I don't know what you are looking for up at that window, Emma said. But I know what it's like to look for someone who isn't there anymore. So if you want to stand here a while and look, I won't make you stop. I'll just sit here with you. The sun went down slow and orange over the ridge, and Emma sat in the dirt until her legs went stiff, and the mosquitoes found her ankles, and Phantom never came closer than 20 feet. But he also never left. He stood at the fence watching the window, and every so often his gaze would drift down to her, hold there a moment, then lift again. It wasn't trust. Not yet, but it was something. She was still sitting there when she heard boots on the path behind her. Not Travis's heavy, confident stride, but something lighter, more careful. She turned to find a man she didn't recognize, standing a respectful distance off, hat in hand, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. Evening, ma'am, he said. Didn't mean to startle you. I'm looking for Margaret Whitmore. Name's Elias Morgan. I understand there's a horse here that's been giving the ranch some trouble. Emma got to her feet, slowly brushing dirt from her skirt, studying him. He wasn't a big man, not the way Travis was, big, leaner, quieter, with the kind of stillness in his posture that made Phantom's ears swing toward him with more curiosity than fear. Depends who you ask about the trouble, Emma said. Travis Boone would tell you the horse is the problem. I'm starting to think the problem might be Travis. Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of Elias Morgan's mouth, there and gone. I've heard that opinion before about men like Travis Boone. He glanced past her toward Phantom, and his eyes changed, sharpened, softened, both at once, the look of a man seeing something he'd been searching for a long while. That's him. The Gray. You know him? I know of him. Word travels in my line of work. He stepped closer to the fence, slow, unthreatening, and Phantom's head came up, but he didn't bolt. I study horses, ma'am. The way they think. The way they remember. I've been 3 counties over chasing rumors of a stallion that screams at midnight, and I have to say I didn't expect to find him on the Carter Ranch. Emma's pulse picked up. You've heard of him before, from where? Elias Morgan looked at her, then really looked, and something passed between them. Not quite recognition, but close to it, the look of 2 people who'd just realized they were chasing the same shadow from different directions. Ma'am, he said carefully, I think you and I might need to have a longer conversation. Because if this is the horse I believe it is, then he didn't wander onto this ranch by accident. And whatever your grandmother knew about him, I suspect it's the reason men far worse than Travis Boone have been looking for him for a very long time. The wind picked up across the pasture, and Phantom's scream soft this time. Almost a question rose up into the darkening sky, aimed once more at that locked and silent window. Mr. Morgan, Emma said, You don't get to say something like that and then talk about longer conversations. Tell me now. What do you mean, men far worse than Travis Boone? Elias Morgan looked at her for a long moment, then glanced past her shoulder toward the dark windows of the house like he was checking who might be listening. How long have you got, ma'am? As long as it takes. Emma. Margaret's voice cut sharp across the yard behind her before Elias could answer. Emma turned to find her aunt standing on the porch steps, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders despite the summer heat. Her eyes fixed on Elias like she'd seen a ghost stand up out of the ground. Who is this man? Elias Morgan, ma'am. He removed his hat properly this time, held it against his chest. I believe your sister wrote to me, more than once. Margaret went very still. You're lying, she said. I've got the letters in my satchel if you'd care to see her handwriting. That's not possible. Isabella's been dead 2 years. I know it, ma'am. I got the last letter after she'd already passed. Her lawyer forwarded it along with a note explaining the circumstances. I've been trying to make my way out here ever since, but I had commitments in Colorado I couldn't break, and by the time I could... He stopped himself, looked down at the hat in his hands. I'm sorry for my delay. I understand now it was 2 years too long. Margaret came down off the porch slow, like her legs weren't fully trusting the ground. What did she write to you about? About him. Elias nodded toward the fence toward Phantom, who stood watching all three of them now with his ears pricked hard forward. About what he is, what he's worth to certain men, and what she was afraid would happen to this ranch if the wrong people found him before she'd finished what she started. What she started, Emma repeated. What does that mean? Elias hesitated. And in that hesitation, Emma saw something she recognized from her own grief, the particular carefulness of a man deciding how much truth a person could carry at once. Ma'am, I don't think this is a conversation for the yard in the dark with a nervous animal listening in. Horses pick up more than folks credit them for, and whatever we discuss tonight, he's going to feel it. As if to prove the point, Phantom's weight shifted, his tail swishing hard, one hoof striking the dirt in a sharp, restless stamp. Fine, Margaret said, though her voice had lost every ounce of its earlier steel. Kitchen, now. They sat around the kitchen table with a single lamp burning low between them, and Elias Morgan laid out 3 letters, the paper soft and worn from handling Isabella Carter's handwriting, slanted and hurried across the pages like she'd written them in a rush, like she'd known she didn't have much time. Emma reached for the top one, then stopped herself looking to Margaret first. Margaret nodded, jaw tight, and Emma picked it up with hands that weren't quite steady. Dr. Morgan, it read, I write to you on the recommendation of a mutual acquaintance who assures me you are a man of discretion as much as expertise. I have in my possession an animal of a bloodline I believe you will find remarkable and troubling in equal measure. I do not wish to commit more to paper than is wise. Please, if your travels ever bring you near the Wyoming territory, seek out the Carter Ranch. Time, I fear, is not entirely on my side. Emma set the letter down. Her throat had gone tight. She knew she was dying, Margaret said quietly. It wasn't a question. I believe she suspected, yes, ma'am. Elias's voice had gone gentle. The second letter is more direct. Emma reached for it before Margaret could stop her. Dr. Morgan. The horse is called Phantasma by the men who bred him, though I have taken to calling him something gentler for his own sake and for mine. He is the last of a line that certain powerful interests believed extinguished. I was wrong to think distance alone would keep him safe. I have had word that he has been seen, and word travels faster than I would like. I am an old woman now, and I do not know how many more seasons I have to finish what I began. If I do not survive to see this through, I ask that you find whoever inherits this ranch and tell them what I could not bring myself to write, even now that this horse is not merely valuable. He is a promise I made, and a debt I have not yet paid. The kitchen was silent except for the lamp's soft hiss. What debt? Emma whispered. Paid to who? I don't know, Elias admitted. The third letter, the one that reached me after her death, was shorter than the others. Almost like she wrote it in a hurry, or wrote it when she was too weak to write much more. He slid it across the table. Emma's eyes moved fast over the few lines. If you are reading this, I am gone, and I did not finish. Find my granddaughter. Tell her the key is not for the room. The key is for him. She will understand when the time comes, if she is patient enough to earn it. Protect the horse until she does. There are men who will come looking, and they will not ask kindly. Emma read it twice. 3 times. The words blurred and sharpened again. The key is not for the room, she said out loud. What room? What key? Margaret's face had gone pale as chalk. She reached out and took the letter from Emma's hands, read it herself, her lips moving slightly over the words. There's a key, Margaret said slowly. In her jewelry box. I found it after she died, and I never could figure what it opened. I assumed it was for that locked room upstairs, so I never tried it anywhere else. Where is it now? In my room. In the top drawer of my dresser. Emma was on her feet before Margaret finished the sentence. Emma. It's midnight, Aunt Margaret. That's when he screams. That's when he looks at the window. Maybe it isn't the window he's calling to at all. Maybe it's the key. Elias finished for her, and something had sharpened in his expression, the look of a man whose long chase had suddenly picked up a fresh, hot scent. Ma'am, I'd strongly suggest we go find out. Together. Not alone, and not in the dark without me there. If I'm right about what that horse is, and what he can do when he's startled, a locked drawer and a nervous mind aren't a safe combination for anybody standing too close. The key was small tarnished silver, worn smooth on one edge, like it had spent years being turned over and over by careful, anxious fingers. Emma held it flat in her palm as the 3 of them crossed the yard, back toward the pasture fence, the lamp swinging light and shadow across the dirt, with every step Elias took beside her. Phantom's ears swung toward them before they'd even reached the rail. He'd been standing in his usual place, aimed up at the dark window. But now, his whole body turned nostrils, working the air, and Emma felt her breath catch at the change in him, the sudden electric attention, the way his front hoof pawed once hard against the ground. Careful now, Elias murmured. Hold it out slow. Let him come to it. Don't force anything. Emma stepped up to the rail, the key trembling slightly in her outstretched hand. Phantom's head lowered, stretched forward, his breath hot and fast against her fingers, as his nose came within an inch of the metal. And then he stopped breathing. Emma felt it happen, the horse's whole body going rigid. His chest suddenly terribly still, like something inside him had locked shut the instant the key touched close enough for him to catch its scent. His eyes widened white, showing all around. And for one horrible second, Emma thought he might rear, might bolt, might do something that would end this before it had properly begun. Instead, he made a sound she had never heard a horse make before. Low. Broken. Almost human in its grief. Oh! Margaret breathed, one hand flying to her mouth. He knows it, Elias said, his voice hushed with something like awe. Ma'am, Mrs. Carter, he recognizes that key. That's not fear. That's memory. Memory of what? I don't know yet, but I'd bet the ranch on it meaning something. Elias's eyes hadn't left the horse. Isabella's letter said it isn't for the room. That means it's for something else. Something on this property most likely, or she wouldn't have left it for you to find here. Emma looked down at the key in her palm, then up at the window, then back at the trembling animal in front of her. The spring house, she said suddenly. Margaret frowned. The old spring house, Emma, that's been abandoned since before I can remember. There's nothing out there but rot and spiders. Grandma used to walk out there, every evening near the end when she still had the strength to walk anywhere at all. I used to think it was just for the quiet. She never let me go with her. Something passed across Margaret's face. Recognition maybe, or the particular ache of realizing you'd missed something important while it was happening right in front of you. She told me she was praying, Margaret said quietly. I never questioned it. She was old and dying, and I thought a woman deserved her privacy for that. Maybe she wasn't praying. Emma closed her fingers around the key. Maybe she was checking on something. Elias straightened his gaze, moving from Emma to the dark tree line beyond the pasture where the old spring house sat somewhere unseen in the summer dark. Then I'd say that's worth a look. Not tonight, it's late, and I won't have either of you stumbling through those woods in the dark on account of my curiosity. But at first light. Travis rides the fence line at dawn, Margaret said. We'd have a window before he's back. Then dawn it is. Phantom's low, mournful sound rose again into the night air, and this time, when Emma reached out and laid her palm flat against his nose, he didn't pull away. He stood there trembling, letting her touch him for the first time since she'd known him, his breath slowing bit by bit under her hand, like something in him had finally cautiously decided to trust. "Hold on," Emma whispered to him. "We're going to find out. I promise you, we're going to find out." Dawn came gray and quiet mist still clinging low to the grass when Emma slipped out the kitchen door with the key knotted into a handkerchief and tucked deep in her apron pocket. Margaret was already waiting by the barn, a lantern unlit in her hand, saved for later use if the woods proved darker than the sky suggested. Elias stood beside her satchel slung across his shoulder, his expression carrying the particular stillness of a man who'd learned patience the hard way. "You didn't sleep," Emma said to him. "Neither did you from the look of things." "No," Emma admitted. "I kept thinking about what she wrote, that she made someone a promise, that there was a debt." "We'll know soon enough." Elias nodded toward the tree line. "Lead the way, Mrs. Carter. This part of the property I don't know." They walked in near silence, the mist swallowing the sound of their footsteps. Emma's heart hammering harder with every step closer to the old spring house. She could see it now, a low stone shape half buried in creeping vine, its wooden door hanging crooked on one rusted hinge. The whole structure looking like it had given up trying to stand upright years ago and was only still standing out of stubbornness. "Careful," Margaret said, catching Emma's sleeve as she moved to push the door open. "Emma, wait." "What?" Margaret's voice caught. "I don't know what we're about to find, and I don't know if I'm ready for it. I've spent 2 years telling myself Isabella left nothing behind but grief and a stubborn horse. If there's more than that in there, I don't know what it does to everything I thought I understood about my sister." Emma reached out and took her aunt's hand, the way she hadn't in longer than she could remember. Not since she was a girl, and Margaret was the stern, unshakable center of the household, rather than a woman standing scared in front of a rotting door. "We'll find out together," Emma said. "Whatever it is." Margaret nodded tight-lipped and let go. The door groaned open on its ruined hinge, and dust rose in the gray morning light, thick enough to make all three of them cough. Inside the spring house was smaller than Emma remembered from childhood. A single low room, the old spring itself long since dried to a crack in the stone floor cobwebs, strung thick between the rafters. And in the far corner, half hidden beneath a rotted horse blanket, sat a wooden chest, iron-banded its lock crusted with rust. Emma's breath caught. "That's it," she whispered. "That has to be it." She crossed the small room fast, kneeling in front of the chest, pulling the handkerchief from her pocket with fingers that had gone clumsy with urgency. The key slid into the lock with a resistance that made her heart stop for one terrible second, and then with a groan of old metal finally giving way, it turned. The lid creaked open. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age, and beneath it folded carefully in oiled cloth what looked like a bundle of documents, their edges yellowed and soft. "Emma," Margaret breathed, kneeling down beside her. "Emma, that's her handwriting." Emma lifted the journal out with both hands, feeling the weight of it, the particular sacredness of holding something a dead woman had meant for her to find. She opened the cover, and there, in Isabella Carter's familiar slanted script, was a single line written larger than the rest, underlined twice, like she'd wanted to make sure no one could miss it. "If you have found this, then you are ready to know the truth about Phantasma and about the man who is coming to take him." Emma looked up at Margaret, then at Elias, whose face had gone taut and pale in the gray morning light. "There's a man coming," Emma said slowly. She wrote that a man is coming to take him. Read further, Elias said, his voice low and urgent. Ma'am, please. We need to know how much time we have. Emma turned the page, her hands unsteady, and had barely begun reading the first paragraph. Something about a ranch far to the south, about a breeding operation built on cruelty, about a foal born wrong-colored and marked for death, before Isabella intervened when the sound of hoofbeats fast and hard came crashing through the mist outside. All three of them froze. That's not Travis's gelding, Margaret said, going white. That's too many horses. Emma shoved the journal back into the chest, slammed the lid, her heart slamming twice as hard against her ribs. Through the crooked door she could see shapes forming out of the mist, 3 riders, then 4, moving fast toward the ranch house. Get down, Elias hissed, pulling both women back from the door deeper into the shadow of the spring house. Don't move. Don't make a sound. They watched through the gap in the broken door as the riders pulled up hard in the yard, dust and mist swirling around their horses' legs. The lead rider swung down first, a tall man in a black coat, too fine for ranch work. His boots polished despite the dust, a silver-headed cane hooked over one arm, though he didn't look like he needed it to walk. That's not one of ours, Margaret whispered. I don't know that man. The stranger stood in the yard, hands on his hips, surveying the house and the barn and the pasture, with the slow assessing gaze of a man taking inventory of something he already considered his. Mrs. Whitmore, he called out, his voice carrying easy and cold across the yard, though no one had yet come out to greet him. I know you're in there. My name is Silas Calloway. I believe you're in possession of something that belongs to me. Emma felt Elias go rigid beside her. You know him? She breathed. I know the name, Elias said, barely audible. Ma'am, Emma, that's the man Isabella was afraid of. That's the breeder, the one who thinks he owns every horse that ever carried that bloodline, living or dead. Calloway's gaze drifted slow and deliberate toward the pasture, toward Phantom, who stood at the far fence, ears pinned flat, every muscle in his body coiled tight with an animal's instant total recognition of danger. A thin, satisfied smile spread across Calloway's face. There you are, he said softly to no one but the horse. I've been looking for you a very long time. Chin. Margaret was the one who moved first, straightening her spine and stepping out from the shadow of the spring house before Emma could stop her brushing dust from her skirts like she hadn't just been crouched hiding 30 seconds before. Aunt Margaret, Emma hissed. Stay there, Margaret whispered back, fierce. Both of you. I'll handle this. She crossed the yard with a steadiness Emma hadn't seen in her since before Isabella's death. Chin lifted every inch the ranch owner Calloway was clearly expecting to meet. Mr. Calloway, Margaret said, stopping a careful distance from him and his men. I don't recall inviting you onto this property. No invitation needed, ma'am, where legal claims are concerned. Calloway's voice stayed pleasant, almost warm, the kind of warmth that made Emma's skin crawl, watching from the springhouse doorway. I understand your late sister acquired an animal some years back, under circumstances that were, shall we say, less than forthright with the original owner. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. Calloway's eyes flicked briefly toward the springhouse, and Emma's heart stopped, certain for one terrible second that he'd seen them, that this was already over before it had begun. But his gaze moved on, sweeping the property, and she realized he was simply surveying, cataloging a man used to counting other people's assets as though they were already his own. That horse in your pasture is the last surviving descendant of a bloodline I spent 15 years developing before your sister saw fit to steal a foal out from under me and vanish him halfway across the territory. He was going to be killed, Margaret said, and her voice shook now, though, whether from fear or fury Emma couldn't tell. A foal born the wrong color for your precious bloodline standards. My sister told me that much before she died. She said you'd have put a newborn animal down over the shade of his coat. Something flickered across Calloway's composed face. Not shame, Emma thought. Something colder. Irritation, maybe, at having his methods questioned by a woman he clearly considered beneath his notice. Breeding is a science, Mrs. Whitmore, not a sentiment. That animal represents flawed stock. He should never have survived infancy, and he certainly has no business standing unbroken and unproductive in some backwater pasture for the better part of a decade. I'm prepared to be generous. $500, and my men will collect him before noon, and you'll never hear from me again. He's not for sale. He was never yours to sell in the first place, Calloway said, and the pleasant warmth had drained entirely from his voice now, leaving something flat and hard beneath it. I have documentation of ownership going back to his sire. I have a judge in Cheyenne who owes me considerably more than $500 in favors. You can take my offer now gracefully, or you can take considerably less once this matter is settled in a courtroom you have no hope of winning in. Your choice, ma'am. But I promise you one way or another that horse leaves this ranch with me. Emma felt Elias's hand close hard around her wrist, holding her still, holding her silent, though every part of her wanted to burst out of that spring house and put herself between Calloway and the pasture fence. Not yet. Elias breathed barely a whisper. Not yet, Emma. We don't have anything to fight him with. Not yet. Margaret stood her ground in the yard, and for one long, terrible moment, Emma thought her aunt might simply agree, might take the easy road, might sell the horse and the trouble both away for $500, and be done with it. Then Margaret's chin came up another inch. Get off my land, Mr. Calloway, she said, before I have my foreman put a bullet through something a great deal less valuable than that horse. Calloway's smile went thin and cold as a blade. You'll regret that decision, Mrs. Whitmore. He turned back toward his horse, swinging up into the saddle with the easy grace of a man who'd never once in his life doubted he'd get what he wanted eventually. I'll be back, and next time I won't be asking so politely. He wheeled his horse around his men falling in behind him and rode back out through the mist the way they'd come, leaving Margaret standing alone in the yard, shoulders shaking, one hand pressed flat against her chest like she was holding her own heart in place. Emma didn't wait for permission this time. She ran from the spring house across the wet grass, catching her aunt just as her knees seemed ready to give out, holding her up the way Margaret had held her up 100 times over the years, without ever once asking for anything back. You were wonderful, Emma said fiercely. Aunt Margaret, you were wonderful. I was terrified, Margaret said, her voice cracking. Emma, that man is going to come back with a judge's order and God knows what else, and I don't know how we fight that. I don't know how a ranch 2 seasons behind on its debts fights a man with friends in Cheyenne. Elias had crossed the yard behind them, his face grim, the journal still tucked safe beneath his arm. We fight it with what your sister left us, he said. Ma'am, Mrs. Whitmore, that journal isn't just sentiment. Isabella wasn't a foolish woman. If she went to the trouble of hiding documentation, of writing to me, of leaving a trail for her granddaughter to follow, I'd wager everything I own that somewhere in these pages is proof of exactly how that foal came into her possession. Proof that might matter a great deal more in a Cheyenne courtroom than Calloway's paid-off judge would like. Then we read it, Emma said. All of it, today. Yeah. They spread the contents of the chest across the kitchen table by mid-morning. The journal, the bundle of documents, a handful of letters tied with fading ribbon, and beneath everything wrapped in a scrap of soft cloth, a small tintype photograph of a much younger Isabella Carter standing beside a foal so pale silver he seemed to glow even in the faded sepia-toned image. That's him, Margaret whispered, running one finger over the photograph's edge without quite touching the surface. That's Phantom, isn't it? As a foal. Phantasma, Elias corrected gently. That's what Calloway's operation called him before your sister renamed him something gentler. Emma had already turned to the journal's first proper entry, her eyes moving fast over Isabella's careful slanted script. I found him in a stall meant for slaughter, the entry read. A newborn colt silver, where his sire and dam were bay, and black, marked by Calloway's own hand, as a defect to be culled, before he cost the operation any grain. I could not leave him there. I have done many foolish things in my 70 years, but I do not count this among them, whatever it costs me. She stole him to save his life, Emma said. Not to steal Calloway's bloodline. To save a foal that man would have killed for the color of his coat. Keep reading, Elias urged. There has to be more. Bills of sale, veterinary records, anything that proves the circumstances. Emma turned pages fast, her heart racing. Margaret reading over her shoulder with her hand pressed tight against her own mouth. Entry after entry detailed Isabella's growing understanding of what she'd taken on, not just a rescued animal, but a bloodline of horses bred for generations toward some singular, almost mythic quality that Calloway's own notes copied carefully into the margins in Isabella's hand, called simply the gift. Calloway breeds for temperament as much as conformation. One entry read, though he would never admit to something so unscientific in his ledgers. He breeds for a horse that reads a rider's fear and grief the way other animals read scent on the wind. He has spent his whole life trying to breed empathy into an animal like it was a trait you could measure with calipers. And in doing so, I believe without ever intending it, he has bred something closer to a miracle than a commodity. And because he cannot sell a miracle at the price he wants, he kills what doesn't fit his ledger. Emma's hands had gone cold. That's why Phantom looks at the window, she said slowly. That's why he screams at midnight. It's not a ghost. It's not superstition. He feels grief the way we feel it. He felt Grandma dying in that room, and he's never stopped feeling it since. Elias nodded slowly, his expression somewhere between wonder and grief of his own. It would explain a great deal. Horses that sensitive to human sorrow. I've read theories, papers dismissed by every serious scientist I know, but I've never seen it in practice. Not like this. There has to be a bill of sale, Margaret said, flipping urgently through the loose documents. Something legal, something we can bring before a judge. Here, Emma said, suddenly pulling a folded paper free from beneath the ribbon-tied letters. She smoothed it flat on the table, and all three of them leaned in over the faded ink. It wasn't a bill of sale. It was a letter addressed to Isabella signed at the bottom, in a hand none of them recognized. Small cramped the writing of someone unused to holding a pen for long. Mrs. Carter, it read. I write to you in secret, for if Mr. Calloway learns I have done so, I will lose my position, and likely worse. I was the stable hand, tasked with drowning the silver colt the night you took him. I could not do it. I told Mr. Calloway the foal died of natural causes, and I buried an empty sack to prove it. I do not know what became of the horse after I left him in the ravine for you to find as we had arranged, but I pray every night that he lived, and that whatever life he found was kinder than the one waiting for him here. If you ever need proof of what was done and nearly done in that stable, know that I will testify to it, whatever the cost, to myself. Josiah Reed. The kitchen fell utterly silent. Josiah Reed, Elias repeated slowly. Ma'am, Mrs. Whitmore, do either of you know that name? Margaret shook her head. Emma did too, though something about it tugged faintly at memory, some half-buried recollection she couldn't yet place. If he's still alive, Elias said, if he's still willing to testify to what he wrote here, that's not just proof that Isabella rescued a doomed animal instead of stealing valuable property. That's proof of animal cruelty on Calloway's part, sworn testimony from a man who worked inside his own operation. That could turn this whole fight around. If he's still alive, Margaret echoed. 20 years is a long time, Dr. Morgan. Men move. Men die. Men change their names when the past comes looking for them. Then we find out, Emma said, and there was a new steel in her voice now, something that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago, when she'd stood at Daniel's graveside, believing the worst thing that could happen to her had already happened. We find Josiah Reed, or we find whoever remembers him, and we get that testimony before Calloway comes back with his judge. Elias was already gathering the documents carefully back into their oiled cloth, his expression sharpening into something purposeful. I know men who might know men in this territory. Horse trainers talk even when they don't mean to. I can ride out today, start asking quiet questions in towns where Calloway's operation would have had dealings. I'm coming with you, Emma said. Emma, Margaret started. I buried my husband 3 weeks ago, Aunt Margaret. I have spent every day since feeling like I was standing outside my own life waiting for something to happen to me instead of doing anything myself. Emma's voice was steady now, steadier than it had been in weeks. That horse out there has been standing at a window every night for 2 years, grieving something he can't even explain. Waiting for somebody to understand him. I understand him better than I've understood anything in a long while. I'm not going to sit in this kitchen while a stranger tries to take him away over the color of his coat. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her tired eyes. Fear still and grief, but underneath it, something that might have been pride. Then you'll take Hank with you, Margaret said finally. Both of you. I won't have my niece riding half the territory alone with a man I met yesterday, however honorable his letters read. And you'll be back before dark, or I swear before God, I will come looking for you myself. Agreed, Elias said. And Emma. Margaret caught her hand as she turned to go, held it a moment, her grip fierce and trembling both at once. Be careful. Calloway is not a man who loses gracefully. If he learns what you're doing before you've got Reed's testimony in hand, I don't know what he's capable of. Emma squeezed her aunt's hand back. I know. And Emma. Margaret's voice caught thick with something that had been building since the springhouse, since the letters, since 2 years of silence finally starting to crack open. Your grandmother would be proud of you. Whatever else comes of this, I wanted you to hear that before you rode out. Emma felt her eyes sting, and for once she let them. They rode out within the hour. Emma on her grandmother's old mare, Elias on a rented gelding he'd left tied at the edge of the property the night before, and Hank Miller bringing up the rear on a stout bay he called Duke, a shotgun resting easy across his saddle horn, like it was as natural to him as breathing. The first town they reached, a scattering of buildings that called itself Larimer Crossing, yielded nothing but shrugged shoulders and blank stares at the name Josiah Reed. The second town, further west, brought a bartender who remembered the name vaguely attached to a man who'd passed through some years back, looking for work, and hadn't stayed long. Headed north, if I recall, the bartender said, wiping down a glass that didn't look like it had been properly clean in years. Said something about a sister up near Deer Creek. Can't swear to it. Was a long while back. Deer Creek, Elias said, once they were back outside in the afternoon heat. That's another half-day's ride at least. We don't have another half-day, Emma said. Calloway could be back at the ranch with a judge's order before we've even found the man, let alone gotten him to Cheyenne to testify. I know it. Elias's jaw tightened. But we don't have much choice unless you've got a faster idea. Emma didn't. She swallowed, her frustration swung back up into the saddle, and they rode on the sun climbing hard and hot, overhead sweat soaking through Emma's collar, the mare's hooves throwing up small clouds of pale dust with every stride. It was Hank who spotted the smoke first, not the lazy curl of a chimney fire, but something thicker, blacker rising from somewhere off to the west of the trail they'd been following. That ain't cook-fire smoke, Hank said, reining Duke to a stop, his weathered face going tight with concern. That's something burning that oughtn't to be. Deer Creek's that direction, Elias said. Emma felt her stomach drop straight through the saddle. Go, she said. Now. They pushed the horses hard, faster than Emma had ridden in years, the wind tearing at her hair, the smoke growing thicker and blacker against the pale afternoon sky the closer they came. When they finally crested the last rise above Deer Creek, what they found stole the breath clean out of Emma's chest. A small cabin set back from a scatter of other homesteads engulfed in flame, the roof already caving in on itself, sparks spiraling up into the hot summer air. And standing well back from the blaze watching it burn, with an expression of cold, satisfied patience, stood 2 men Emma recognized instantly from the yard that morning. Calloway's men, their horses tethered a safe distance from the fire's heat. No, Emma breathed. No. Stay back, Hank ordered, already swinging his shotgun down off the saddle horn. Both of you stay back. But Elias had already spurred his horse forward, closing the distance fast, and Emma followed, without thinking, her heart hammering against her ribs. What have you done? Elias shouted, pulling up hard in front of the two men who turned with easy, unhurried menace, like men who'd done this sort of thing before and expected no real consequence for it. Cabin fire, one of them said, almost bored. Terrible accident. This territory's awful dry this time of year. Where is he? Emma demanded, her voice shaking with a fury she hadn't known she was capable of. Where's Josiah Reed? Something flickered across the man's face, surprise quickly smothered that she knew the name at all. Don't know who you mean, ma'am. Emma. Elias's voice had gone low and urgent beside her. Emma, look. He nodded toward the tree line beyond the burning cabin where a figure was half crouched in the shadow of the brush, watching them with wide, frightened eyes, an older man, thin, his clothes singed at the edges, one hand pressed to a burn along his forearm. Josiah Reed had survived, but barely, and only because he'd run. You get on out of here! The second of Calloway's men said, his hand drifting meaningfully toward the pistol at his hip. This ain't your business, folks. Whatever burned down today burned down accidental, and that's the story you'll be repeating if anybody asks. Hank's shotgun came up level and steady, and for one long, breathless moment, the whole clearing seemed to hold still flame, crackling smoke rolling thick and black into the sky. 4 strangers and a terrified old man frozen in a standoff that could tip toward violence with a single wrong word. I'd think real careful. Hank said, his voice flat and calm in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been, about what you do next, mister, because there's a woman standing behind me who's already buried a husband this month, and I don't believe she's in the mood to bury nobody else on account of 2 men who set fire to an old fella's home. The seconds stretched impossibly long. Then, slow, deliberate, the first man raised both hands, palms out, a thin, humorless smile pulling at his mouth. No trouble here, he said. We were just leaving. They mounted their horses without another word and rode off toward the west, unhurried, like men confident this wasn't over, only postponed. The moment they were gone, Emma was off her horse and running toward the tree line, dropping to her knees beside Josiah Reed, whose whole body was shaking, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. You're safe, Emma said, though she wasn't entirely certain it was true. You're safe now. We're not here to hurt you. We're here because of Isabella Carter. Something changed in the old man's face at the name recognition, and beneath it, a grief so old and deep it had clearly never fully healed. Isabella, he rasped. Is she? She passed 2 years ago. Emma kept her voice gentle, even as her own heart pounded fast with everything that had just happened, everything still hanging unresolved in the smoke-thick air. But her horse, the one you saved that night, he's alive. He's on her ranch, and a man named Calloway is trying to take him back, and I need your help to stop it. Josiah Reed's eyes filled slowly with tears, cutting clean tracks through the soot on his weathered face. He lived, the old man whispered. God help me, all these years I never knew for certain. He lived. He lived? Emma confirmed. And he's been standing at a window every night since she died, waiting for somebody to understand what happened to him. I think that somebody might be you, Mr. Reed. I think you're the only man alive who can tell a judge in Cheyenne exactly what Calloway did in that stable, and exactly what my grandmother saved that horse from. The old man looked past her toward the burning ruin of what had been his home for however many years, everything he owned reduced to ash and smoke behind him. And then back at Emma, something hardening in his tear-streaked face that looked almost like resolve. They came for me because they knew I'd talk eventually, he said. Burned my home to scare me quiet. But I already lost everything I had today, except my own conscience, ma'am, and I'm getting too old to keep carrying a secret that's been sitting wrong in my chest for 20 years. He straightened, wincing at the burn along his arm, but his voice came out steadier now, stronger. I'll go to Cheyenne. I'll tell that judge everything I saw in Calloway's stable, and everything I did to save that colt, and everything it's cost me since to keep it quiet. It's past time somebody heard the truth. Behind them, the cabin finally collapsed in on itself with a great groaning crash, sparks spiraling up bright against the darkening sky, and Emma felt something settle hard and certain in her chest. Not fear anymore, not grief, but something closer to purpose. "Then we ride for Cheyenne," she said, "before Calloway realizes we found you first." They didn't make it a mile before Josiah Reed stopped walking. "Wait," he said, planting his feet in the dirt of the trail, one hand pressed to the burn on his arm. "Wait, just give me a moment." Emma turned back, Elias and Hank pulling up their horses beside her. "Mr. Reed, I know this is a lot to ask of you in one day, but Calloway's men could already be riding back to report." "It ain't that." The old man's voice shook. "It's that I need you to understand something before I get on a horse and ride toward a courtroom full of powerful men. I need you to understand I'm not doing this because I'm brave. I'm doing this because I'm tired. 20 years tired." He looked at Emma, his eyes red-rimmed from smoke and grief both. "You said the horse waits at a window every night. You said he grieves." "He does. Then he's not the only one who's been standing at a window for 20 years, ma'am. I just didn't have 4 legs to carry me back to check on what I left behind." Emma felt something crack open in her chest, some understanding she hadn't had words for until just now. "Then let's go finish it. Both of you. Him and you." Josiah nodded, jaw tight, and let Hank help him up onto the spare horse they'd brought. They rode through the afternoon and into evening, pushing the horses as hard as the animals could bear, stopping only once at a creek to water them and let Josiah catch his breath, his burned arm wrapped now in a strip torn from Emma's petticoat. "Cheyenne's still a full day's ride from here," Elias said, studying the darkening sky. "We won't make it before nightfall." "There's a way station 2 hours on," Hank said. "Rough, but it'll do for sleeping rough and getting fresh water. We push on to Cheyenne at first light." Emma didn't like it. Every hour felt like an hour Calloway could use to reach Margaret first to bring his judge and his paperwork down on the ranch, while Emma was 2 counties away chasing testimony. But she also knew exhausted horses and an injured old man weren't going to win anybody's case in a Cheyenne courtroom. 2 hours, she agreed. "Then we ride through the night if we have to." The way station turned out to be little more than a lean-to and a corral run by a leathery old widow named Constance, who asked no questions and charged double for the privilege of not asking them. Emma sat by the low fire that evening, picking at a plate of beans. She had no appetite for watching Josiah Reed stare into the flames like he was looking through them at something 20 years gone. "Tell me about him," Emma said quietly. "About that night, if you can." Josiah was quiet a long moment. Then he began to speak slow, at first the words coming easier the further he got into them, like a wound finally being lanced. "Calloway's operation wasn't cruel in the way most folks picture cruelty," he said. "No whips, not usually. Worse than that in its own way. Cold, calculated, every foal weighed and measured against a ledger before it ever took its first proper breath. Color confirmation, temperament, everything scored, everything judged. That colt came out silver when his sire threw bay dam, threw black, and Calloway took one look at him and said the word defect like he was reading off a grocery list." His hands twisted together in his lap. "Told me to take him down to the creek and drown him quiet before he cost the operation any more feed than he already had. Foal wasn't but 3 days old. And you couldn't do it," Emma said. "I got him to the water's edge, and he looked up at me, ma'am, with eyes that didn't look like they belonged on an animal that young. Like he already understood what was happening to him. I couldn't do it. I've held that shame and that mercy, both in the same hand for 20 years, not knowing which one it really was." His voice cracked. "Mrs. Carter found me there at the creek, colt still breathing, me sitting in the water, not able to finish it. She didn't ask a single question. She just said, 'Give him to me.' And I did, and I told Calloway the deed was done, and I buried an empty feed sack in the mud so there'd be something to point to if anybody checked. And nobody checked. Calloway checked everything eventually. That's why I ran 3 years later when I heard he'd started asking around about a stable hand who'd handled the culling that season. I've been running pieces of my life away ever since, changing towns, changing names once or twice. And today, they finally caught up." His jaw worked. "Burned my home down around me for a secret I should have told a judge the day it happened." Elias, sitting across the fire, had gone very still, his expression sharpening with something that looked like the missing piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "Mr. Reed," You said Calloway scored every foal on a ledger. Wade measured judged. Do you know if he kept those ledgers, written records? Kept everything, Josiah said. Man was obsessive about his paperwork. Had ledgers going back to his own father's breeding operation if the stories were true. Then somewhere, Elias said slowly, there's a written record of a silver colt marked for culling on the exact date Isabella's journal describes. A record in Calloway's own hand, cross-referenced against a foal he's now claiming was simply stolen property, never marked as a defect at all. If we can get our hands on that ledger, he'll have destroyed it, Emma said. The second he realized we were looking. Maybe, Elias allowed, or maybe a man that arrogant never imagined anybody would dare go looking in the first place. Men like Calloway don't burn their own paperwork, Emma. They believe their paperwork protects them. It's the rest of us he thinks needs burning. The fire cracked and settled between them, and Emma pulled her shawl tighter against the cooling night air, her mind racing through everything they now knew, everything still standing between them and a courtroom in Cheyenne. We ride at first light, she said again, mostly to herself. She didn't sleep that night, not properly. She lay on the thin bedroll Constance had provided, staring up at a sky thick with more stars than she'd ever seen from the ranch, and found herself thinking not of Calloway, not of the trial ahead, but of Daniel, of the particular ache of realizing that 3 weeks ago she would never have believed herself capable of any of this. Riding half the territory, standing her ground against armed men, holding a terrified old man's hand while he confessed a 20-year sin. Daniel would have been proud of her, she thought, or maybe frightened for her, maybe both. She must have drifted eventually because she woke to Elias's hand on her shoulder, gentle, and the gray light of not quite dawn creeping over the horizon. Time, he said quietly. Hank's already got the horses saddled. They rode out before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, and Emma felt the day's urgency settle into her bones, like a second heartbeat. Cheyenne sat a hard day's ride ahead, and somewhere behind them, she knew Calloway was almost certainly already moving toward the ranch, toward Margaret, toward whatever legal weapon his paid judge could produce fastest. They were perhaps 3 hours into the ride, cresting a low rise with the trail stretching flat and empty ahead of them, when Hank suddenly reined Duke to a hard stop, one hand raised. "Riders," he said, "coming up fast behind." Emma's stomach dropped. She twisted in the saddle to look, and sure enough, a cloud of dust was rising on the trail behind them, 3 shapes moving at a dead gallop. "Calloway's men," Elias said grimly. "Has to be. They must have circled back after Deer Creek followed our trail." "We can't outrun them on tired horses," Hank said. "Not with Mr. Reed already worn thin." "Then we don't run," Emma said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. "We stand." "Emma, they're not going to shoot us in broad daylight on an open trail, Elias. Not with 3 witnesses and a wounded old man who's already agreed to testify against their employer. That's the kind of crime that hangs a man, and Calloway's too careful for that. Whatever they want, it isn't blood. Not yet." Elias didn't look reassured, but he didn't argue either, and Hank's shotgun came up level and ready as the 3 riders closed the distance and pulled up hard, 20 feet off, dust settling slow around them. It wasn't the same 2 men from Deer Creek. This time, Silas Calloway himself rode at the center, his black coat dusty, now his composure fraying at the edges in a way Emma hadn't seen the morning before. "Mrs. Carter," Calloway said, his voice tight. "You've led me on quite a chase." "Mr. Calloway?" Emma kept her chin up, her voice level, though her heart hammered fast enough she could feel it in her throat. "I don't believe we have anything left to discuss. You made your offer. My aunt refused it. That should be the end of things." "It would be," Calloway said, "if you hadn't ridden half the territory looking for a man I specifically instructed to keep his mouth shut 20 years ago." His eyes moved past her, landing hard on Josiah Reed, and something ugly flickered across his face. "Josiah, I confess I'm surprised to find you still breathing." Josiah didn't flinch. though Emma saw his hands tighten on his reins. "You burned my home yesterday, Silas. You'll forgive me if I don't care much for your surprise." "Business," Calloway said, dismissive. "Conducted by men working under my employ, without my direct instruction, I assure you. I don't condone arson." His smile came thin and cold. "Theft, on the other hand, theft of livestock, theft of documentation, that I take a great deal more personally." "Nobody's stolen anything of yours," Emma said. "That horse was marked for death by your own hand over the color of his coat. My grandmother saved a dying animal's life. That's not theft, Mr. Calloway. That's mercy, and if you had the smallest shred of it in you yourself, you wouldn't be out here chasing a widow and a burned old man across half of Wyoming territory trying to bury the truth a second time." Something flashed hot and dangerous behind Calloway's eyes, the pleasant mask slipping fully away for the first time since Emma had met him. "You understand nothing about what that animal represents. 15 years of careful breeding, generations of bloodline refinement, and your grandmother took my most promising specimen and let it run wild and useless in some backwater pasture instead of realizing his full—" "He's not a specimen," Emma cut in, her voice rising despite herself. "He's not a bloodline, or an investment, or a defect. He's a living animal who's been grieving a dead woman for 2 years because she was the only person who ever showed him a moment's kindness in his entire life, and you are not taking him back to a place that would have drowned him as a newborn foal for the crime of being born the wrong color." The trail went silent, except for the horse's restless shifting and the distant call of a hawk somewhere overhead. "You have spirit, Mrs. Carter," Calloway said, finally, quiet and cold. "I'll grant you that. It won't save you in a courtroom, but I admire it nonetheless." He gathered his reins, his gaze sweeping over the small group one last time. Emma Elias Hank's leveled shotgun, Josiah's grim, unbroken silence. "I have a judge in Cheyenne who has ruled in my favor on lesser matters than this. I have documentation of a bloodline going back 3 generations. And I have considerably more patience than you seem to credit me with. I will see that horse return to my operation, Mrs. Carter, whether it happens gracefully or otherwise. I'd suggest you spend what time you have left preparing your aunt for that reality, rather than wasting it chasing old men through burned-out homesteads." He wheeled his horse and rode off without waiting for a response, his 2 men falling in behind him, and Emma sat frozen in the saddle long after the dust of their departure had begun to settle her whole body, trembling with adrenaline and fury both. "He's going for the judge," Elias said grimly. "Today. We need to move faster than he does." What? They reached Cheyenne as the sun began its long slide toward evening, the town sprawling out ahead of them, louder and busier than anything Emma had seen since her wedding trip to Denver 3 years before. Elias led them straight to the territorial courthouse, a squat brick building with a flag hanging limp in the windless heat, and it was there on the courthouse steps that they found their first real piece of luck in 2 days. A young clerk, harried and ink-stained, informed them that Judge Harmon Whitfield, the Judge Calloway had been so confident about, was in fact not the judge scheduled to hear property disputes that week. "Judge Whitfield took ill sudden 3 days back," the clerk said, shuffling through a stack of papers. "Judge Eleanor Priest is sitting in his place till he's recovered. Only judge in the territory, far as I know, who ain't beholden to half the cattle and horse money in Wyoming. Ornery as a wet cat from what I hear, but fair." Emma felt something like hope flare hot and sudden in her chest for the first time in 2 days. "When can we bring a matter before her?" "Depends on the matter, ma'am." "Animal cruelty," Elias said, stepping forward, the oiled cloth bundle of documents clutched tight beneath his arm. "And a fraudulent claim of ownership with sworn testimony to support it. We need to file before a man named Silas Calloway files his own claim first." The clerk's eyebrows rose. "Calloway. Heard that name plenty this week already? Man's been asking after Judge Whitfield since Tuesday, real insistent-like, before he found out the judge weren't sitting no more." A slow, satisfied look crossed the clerk's tired face. "Reckon he's in for a surprise if he's counting on a ruling he already bought and paid for." "Can we see Judge Priest today?" Emma pressed. "She's hearing cases till 5. I can maybe squeeze you in as the last matter of the day. But you'd best have your evidence in good order, ma'am. She don't suffer fools or wasted time from what I've heard tell." "We have it," Emma said, glancing at Elias at the journal and the letters, and Josiah Reed standing tired but resolute beside them. "We have everything we need." Judge Eleanor Priest turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman, well past 60. Her gray hair pulled back severe beneath a black cap, her courtroom manner brisk enough that Emma understood immediately why the clerk had called her ornery. She listened to Elias's opening statement with an expression of polite, unhurried skepticism that made Emma's stomach twist with nerves until Josiah Reed took the stand. The old man's voice shook at first, but steadied as he spoke, laying out the whole ugly truth of Calloway's breeding ledgers. The culling of foals marked defective the night 20 years past when he'd stood at a creek's edge with a 3-day-old colt and found himself unable to finish what he'd been ordered to do. "And you're prepared to swear to this under oath," Judge Priest said when he'd finished, "knowing full well it exposes you to whatever consequence Mr. Calloway's lawyers might attempt to bring against you for your own role in the original deception." "I am, Your Honor." Josiah's voice didn't waver. "Man burned my home down yesterday to keep me quiet. I figure I've got considerably less to lose by speaking than I do by staying silent a day longer." Judge Priest's sharp eyes moved to the burn still visible along his forearm, and something in her expression shifted just slightly the first crack Emma had seen in that unhurried skepticism. "Bailiff," the judge said, "note for the record that the witness bears a recent burn injury consistent with his testimony." "Continue, Mrs. Carter's counsel." Elias laid out Isabella's letters. Next, her journal entries. The tintype photograph of a young silver foal beside an old woman who'd risked everything to save him. Judge Priest examined each piece with the same unhurried care, her pen scratching notes across a legal pad, her expression giving away nothing. It was nearly 5 o'clock, the courtroom's few remaining onlookers restless in their seats, when the courthouse doors banged open and Silas Calloway strode in. His composure cracked wide open, now fury written plain across his face. "Your Honor," he began, "I demand to know why proceedings are being conducted on a matter of my property without proper notice to—" "Mr. Calloway," Judge Priest said without looking up from her notes, "you'll take a seat and hold your tongue until I've finished reviewing the evidence already before this court, or I'll have you removed and rule in your absence. Your choice." Calloway's jaw tightened, but he sat glaring across the courtroom at Emma with an expression that made her skin crawl even from 20 feet away. The judge took another long moment, flipping back through Josiah's testimony, through Isabella's journal, through the faded ledger page. Elias had finally produced a single torn sheet, salvaged from the bottom of the chest, bearing Calloway's own cramped handwriting, beside a foal's birth date, and the single damning word cull. "Mr. Calloway," Judge Priest said finally, setting down her pen, "I have before me sworn testimony from a former employee of yours, corroborated by a private journal, kept by the deceased woman who took possession of the animal in question, and a page from what appears to be your own breeding ledger, marking a silver colt for destruction on a date that aligns precisely with the testimony given. Do you dispute the authenticity of this ledger page?" Calloway's face had gone pale and tight. "That page is decades old, Your Honor, taken entirely out of context." "Is it your handwriting?" A long silence. "It is," Calloway admitted low. "Then it seems to this court," Judge Priest said, "that whatever claim you believe you hold on this animal is considerably weaker than a claim, built on the plain fact that you ordered a living creature, killed for a defect, no more meaningful than the color of its hide, and that Isabella Carter's actions, whatever technical laws they may have bent, were undertaken to prevent an act of needless cruelty. This court finds considerably more troubling than any property dispute you've brought before it." She lifted her pen again. "I'm prepared to rule that the horse in question currently residing on the Carter Ranch is the rightful property of Isabella Carter's estate, and by extension her surviving family, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am referring the matter of the culling ledger and Mr. Reed's testimony to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for further review regarding potential charges of animal cruelty against Mr. Calloway's operation." The courtroom erupted into low murmurs. Emma felt her whole body go weak with relief, tears springing hot and sudden to her eyes as Elias's hand found her shoulder, steadying her. But Calloway was already on his feet, his composure shattered entirely. Now his voice rising loud and furious across the courtroom. "This is absurd. That animal is worth more than this entire ranch combined, and you would hand him over on the word of a disgraced stable hand and a dead woman's diary." "Mr. Calloway." Judge Priest said, her voice sharp as a blade. "Now, you will sit down, or I will have you held in contempt. This court's ruling stands. You are free to appeal through proper channels, but you will not set foot on the Carter property again without legal authorization. And if I learn that any further harm comes to Mr. Reed or to anyone else connected to this testimony, I will personally see to it that you spend considerably more time explaining yourself to this court than you'd care to." Calloway stood frozen a long moment, fury and humiliation warring plain across his face before he turned without another word and stormed from the courtroom, his boots striking hard against the wooden floor. Emma let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 2 full days. "It's not over," Elias said quietly, even as relief washed visible across his own face. "A man like that doesn't simply accept defeat. He'll appeal. He'll find some other angle. Maybe," Emma said. "But today, we won. Today, Phantom is safe." She looked toward Josiah Reed, who stood trembling with something that looked for the first time since Emma had met him like genuine peace. Today, 20 years of silence finally did some good instead of harm. They didn't linger in Cheyenne. Emma's mind had already turned back toward the ranch, toward Margaret waiting anxious for word, toward the horse, who didn't yet know his fate had just been decided in a courtroom 2 counties away. They rode out that evening, under a sky gone violet and gold, pushing the tired horses toward home, even as darkness fell heavy around them. It was well past midnight when they finally crested the last rise above the Carter Ranch, and Emma's heart caught at what she saw waiting below. Every window in the house was lit. Figures moved fast across the yard, lanterns swinging, and from the north pasture came a sound Emma had come to know as well as her own heartbeat. Phantom screaming louder and more desperate than she'd ever heard him. "Something's wrong." Emma breathed, already spurring her exhausted mare into a final desperate gallop down the slope. She reached the yard to find Margaret running toward her face, white with terror. Travis Boone standing near the barn with an expression Emma couldn't read in the lantern light. "Emma, thank God." Margaret grabbed her arm the second she was down from the saddle. "It's Phantom. Something's happened to him. He's been screaming for an hour, and Travis says he's hurt." Travis called out, his voice tight in a way Emma had never heard from him before, none of his usual swagger left in it. "Mrs. Carter, I don't know what did it, but that horse is bleeding bad, and he won't let nobody near him but you." Emma didn't wait to hear anything more. She ran for the pasture fence, vaulting it, without thinking, sprinting across the dark grass toward the pale, thrashing shape she could just make out in the moonlight, and stopped dead, her heart seizing at what she found waiting there. Phantom was down on his side legs, thrashing weak against the trampled grass, blood dark and wet along his left flank, and for one horrible, breathless second, Emma thought Calloway's men had come back to finish what the courtroom had denied them. "Somebody get a lantern over here," she screamed, dropping to her knees in the dirt beside him, her hands hovering desperate over the wound before she dared touch it. "Emma, don't—" Margaret's voice right behind her now, breathless from running. "Don't get too close, he's thrashing, he knows me." Emma's voice came out fierce, certain, even as her hands shook. "He's not going to hurt me." Phantom's eye rolled toward her, wide and white-rimmed with pain, and something in him seemed to still just slightly at the sound of her voice. "Easy," Emma whispered, laying her palm flat against his sweat-soaked neck. "Easy. I'm here. I'm here now." Elias arrived at a dead-run satchel already open, his hands moving fast and sure over the wound the moment the lantern light gave him enough to see by. "It's a gunshot," he said grim. "Grazed him along the flank, not deep, thank God, but he's lost blood, and he's terrified half out of his mind." "A gunshot?" Emma's head snapped up. "Who? I don't know." Travis had come up behind them now, his usual bravado gone, entirely replaced by something raw and shaken. "I heard it from the bunkhouse, come running, found him already down and bleeding, didn't see nobody. Whoever it was, they were gone before I got here." "Calloway." Emma said the name coming out of her like a curse. "He said he wasn't done. He said he'd see this settled one way or another. The judge ruled against him not 6 hours ago," Elias said, working fast, cleaning the wound with steady, practiced hands, despite the fury tightening his jaw. "If this is his doing, he's moved from lawsuits to attempted destruction of property he no longer has any legal claim to. That's not desperation, Emma. That's a man making sure nobody wins if he can't." Phantom's breathing had gone ragged, his eyes rolling with pain and fear, both as Elias worked and Emma stayed pressed close against his neck, murmuring low and steady, the same wordless comfort she'd offered him that first night at the fence line. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You've survived worse than this. You survived a creek bed and a man who was supposed to kill you. You're not going to let a coward's bullet finish what he couldn't." "The wound's not fatal," Elias said, finally sitting back on his heels, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "But he's lost a fair amount of blood and the shock of it." He glanced up at Emma, something careful in his expression. "Horses this sensitive, this attuned to human emotion, the way Isabella's journal describes, I don't know what an attack like this does to an animal like him. Physical wounds one thing. What it does to his spirit after everything else he's already carried, I can't promise you." "He'll heal," Emma said, fierce, refusing to hear anything else. "He has to." They moved him to the barn before dawn, Phantom stumbling and trembling between Emma and Hank on either side, Elias murmuring instructions about rest and clean water and time. Margaret hovered in the doorway, the whole while her face still pale with shock, and it was there in the gray light before sunrise that she finally said the thing Emma could see she'd been holding back. "I should have listened to you from the start," Margaret said quietly. "About all of it. Isabella, the horse. I spent 2 years telling myself it was easier to ignore what I didn't understand than to face it, and now look what it's cost us." "It's not your fault, Aunt Margaret." "Isn't it?" Margaret's voice cracked. "If I'd let you look into this sooner, if I hadn't been so determined to sell that animal off and be rid of the whole complicated mess of it, we might have found Josiah Reed's testimony a year ago. 2 years ago. Before Calloway ever had cause to come here with a gun in his man's hand." She wiped hard at her eyes with the back of her wrist. "I was so tired, Emma. Tired of carrying this ranch alone after your grandmother died. Tired of a horse that reminded me every single night of everything I didn't understand about my own sister. It was easier to want it gone than to sit with how much I didn't know." Emma reached out and took her aunt's hand, the gesture coming easier now than it ever had before all of this began. "We know now," she said. "Both of us, and he's still here. That's what matters." Margaret nodded, tears slipping free at last, and for a long moment the two women simply stood together in the barn's gray morning light, watching Phantom's ragged breathing slowly begin to even out under Elias's careful hands. Word came 3 days later, carried by a rider from Cheyenne, that shattered whatever fragile relief the ranch had managed to hold on to. Calloway had filed an emergency appeal. He's claiming Judge Priest's ruling was compromised. Elias read aloud from the letter, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "On account of," and I quote, "undue sympathy generated by testimony of questionable reliability from a witness with a documented history of deception toward my operation." He's asking for a new hearing before a judge of his own choosing, and he's requesting an immediate injunction preventing the horse from being moved sold, or, and this is the part that ought to concern us most, exhibited publicly until the matter is settled. Exhibited publicly? Margaret frowned. Why would that concern him? Elias set the letter down, his expression grim. "Because the winter exhibition is barely 2 months off, and if I understand correctly from what I've gathered these past weeks, that exhibition draws buyers, breeders, and horsemen from every corner of this territory and beyond. If Calloway can keep Phantom hidden away, tied up in legal limbo, unseen by anyone who might recognize his bloodline or his quality, He's buying himself time to find a friendlier judge, or worse, time to arrange for something to happen to the horse. Quietly out of the public eye, where there'd be no witnesses left to testify to anything at all. Emma felt cold dread settle deep in her stomach. "You think he means to kill him?" "I think," Elias said carefully, "that a man who already tried to shoot that horse in the dark of night isn't above trying again, especially if he believes the legal battle is slipping away from him for good. The exhibition ironically might be the safest place for Phantom to be. Public. Witnessed. Too visible for Calloway to risk another attempt without exposing himself entirely. Then we take him," Emma said. "We enter him in the exhibition ourselves before Calloway's injunction can stop us." "Emma," Margaret started. "He's still healing. The wound's barely closed, and even if it were, that horse has never once let anyone but you get within 10 feet of him calmly. You want to bring him before hundreds of strangers in a public arena with Calloway himself very likely standing in the crowd. I want to bring him somewhere Calloway can't touch him in the dark," Emma said. "I want the whole territory to see exactly what my grandmother saved, and exactly what kind of man tried to destroy it. If Judge Priest's ruling gets overturned by some Judge Calloway's bought and paid for, I want there to be 100 witnesses standing in that arena who saw the truth with their own eyes before any courtroom gets the chance to twist it." Silence settled over the kitchen, heavy and considering. "It's a risk," Elias said finally. "A considerable one. But I confess, Mrs. Carter, I don't disagree with your reasoning." "There's another problem," Travis said. Speaking up from where he'd been standing quiet near the doorway, a presence Emma had almost forgotten was there, given how little he'd said since the shooting 3 nights before. Something in him had shifted since that night, some of the old swagger gone entirely. "Exhibition requires a demonstration. Riding or groundwork, something that shows the horse's training and temperament before a panel of judges. That animal's never once accepted a saddle, never accepted a bridle, far as I've ever seen. What exactly do you aim to demonstrate?" Emma hadn't thought that far ahead, and the question landed heavy in the quiet kitchen. "Trust," Elias said slowly into the silence. "Not saddle work. Not roping or reining the way exhibitions usually judge a horse's training. Something else. Something closer to what Isabella was building toward before she died, if her journal is to be believed. A demonstration of the very quality Calloway's whole operation was bred for, and never managed to properly harness a horse and a rider, communicating without force, without control, purely through trust and understanding. "Nobody's ever done that at the winter exhibition," Travis said. "Judges wouldn't know what they were looking at." "Then we'll show them," Emma said, "and let them learn." The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of exhausting, careful work. Emma spent every morning and every evening in the pasture, with Phantom sitting, first always sitting, letting him choose the distance between them, letting the silence do the work that force never could. Elias stayed on at the ranch officially to oversee the horse's continued recovery, though Emma suspected, and Margaret's knowing looks confirmed that his reasons for lingering had grown to include considerably more than professional obligation. "You're staring again," Margaret said one evening, catching Emma watching Elias work with Phantom at the fence line, the two of them moving together in some quiet, wordless rhythm that had taken weeks to build. "I'm not staring. Emma Louise Carter. I raised you well enough to recognize staring when I see it." Margaret's mouth curved, the first real lightness Emma had seen in her aunt in longer than she could remember. "It's all right, you know, to feel something, even now, even with everything else." Emma felt her cheeks warm, looked down at her hands. "It hasn't even been 3 months, Aunt Margaret, since Daniel." "I know it." Margaret's voice softened. "Grief doesn't work on anybody's calendar but its own, Emma, and feeling something warm in the middle of all this dark doesn't mean you loved Daniel any less, or that you're required to carry this sorrow alone forever to prove it meant something. Your grandmother lost your grandfather 30 years before she died, and she never stopped loving him, and she also never stopped living the whole rest of her life, besides." She squeezed Emma's shoulder. "Don't let anybody, including yourself, tell you there's a proper way to grieve that doesn't leave room for anything else." Emma didn't answer, but she let the words settle somewhere deep. somewhere that had been closed off tight since the day they'd buried Daniel. And when she looked back toward the fence line, toward Elias's patient, steady hands working alongside Phantom's slow, hard-won trust, she let herself feel it just a little. Just enough. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived on an ordinary evening that Emma would remember for the rest of her life as anything but. She'd been sitting at the fence as always, Phantom grazing 30 feet off, when he lifted his head. Suddenly ears swiveling toward the house, toward that same second-story window he'd stared at for 2 long years. But this time he didn't scream. He didn't tremble. He simply looked long and steady. And then, for the first time since Emma had known him, he turned away from the window entirely and walked toward her, instead, slow and deliberate, until he stood close enough that his breath stirred the loose hair at her temple. "Phantom," Emma whispered, hardly daring to move. He lowered his head, resting it against her shoulder, heavy and warm and trusting in a way he'd never once allowed before, and Emma felt tears spring hot and sudden to her eyes as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "You don't have to look anymore," she whispered into his mane. "She's not gone from you. She's here now in a different way. She's in the ranch, in the journal, in everything she left behind for us to find. And I'm here too. I'm not going anywhere." Elias, watching from the barn doorway, didn't say a word. But when Emma finally looked up, wiping her eyes, she found his expression carrying something she recognized instantly, because she'd started to feel it. Too quiet and slow, and entirely unexpected. Something that had nothing to do with grief at all. "He trusts you completely now," Elias said softly, crossing to join her at the fence. "That's not training, Emma. That's not even patience, not anymore. That's love plain as I've ever seen it between a person and an animal." "Is that what your studies call it?" Emma asked, a small smile tugging at her mouth despite everything. "No," Elias admitted. "My studies don't have a word for it at all. I've spent 15 years trying to understand horses like him, and I've never once seen anything close to what you've built with him in a matter of weeks." He hesitated, something uncertain crossing his features for the first time since Emma had met him. "I don't quite have the words for what I've been building either, if I'm honest with you. But I find myself in no hurry to leave this ranch, even with my professional obligations elsewhere pulling at me daily." Emma's heart caught warm and unfamiliar and a little bit frightening. "Elias, you don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I only wanted you to know it. Whatever comes of the exhibition, whatever comes after, I'm not in any hurry to be anywhere but here." Calloway's appeal moved faster than any of them anticipated. Word arrived just 10 days before the exhibition that a new judge, a man named Cornelius Faust with a reputation, Elias grimly reported for ruling generously in favor of whoever had lined his pockets. Most recently, had agreed to hear Calloway's case with a decision expected the very week of the winter exhibition itself. "He's timed it deliberately," Margaret said, reading the letter with hands that trembled with fury rather than fear now. "If Faust rules in Calloway's favor before the exhibition, he can have Phantom seized before we ever get the chance to show him publicly. Then we move up our own plans," Emma said. "We petition to have the exhibition demonstration count as evidence in the appeal itself. If 100 witnesses see what that horse truly is, see the very quality Calloway's whole operation was built to produce and never managed, that's harder for even a bought judge to simply dismiss." Elias was already nodding, already reaching for paper and ink. Judge Priest might support such a petition even outside her own jurisdiction. Her ruling was thorough, well documented. If she's willing to write a formal statement urging Judge Faust to consider the public demonstration as relevant evidence, she will. Emma said with a certainty she felt down to her bones. She saw what that animal survived. She won't let a bought judge undo it quietly. They sent the petition by fastest rider that same evening, and the days that followed passed in a taut, anxious blur of preparation. Phantom's continued training careful and patient. The two of them building toward a demonstration Emma still wasn't entirely certain would work alongside a legal battle whose outcome remained maddeningly out of their hands. It was 4 days before the exhibition when Travis Boone found Emma alone in the barn, his hat twisted anxious in his hands, an expression on his face she'd never once seen from him in all the months she'd known him. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I owe you an apology. Owe that horse one too, though I don't suppose he'll ever understand the words." Emma straightened, surprised. "Travis, I've trained horses my whole life the only way I ever knew." He said the words coming rough like they cost him something to say. "Fear first, control after. Man taught me that method same as his father taught him, and I never once questioned it, not till I watched you build something with that animal I couldn't have managed in 10 years of roping and breaking." He looked down at his hat. "I was wrong about him. Wrong about a lot of things, I reckon. I'd like to help if you'll have me. With the exhibition. Whatever you need." Emma studied him a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his weathered face against months of frustration and fear he'd caused. "Why the change of heart, Travis, truly? Truth is," he said slowly, "I heard what Calloway's operation did, culling foals over the color of their coat. Drowning them or ordering them drowned, like they were nothing but a bad batch of grain gone to waste." His jaw tightened. "I've been rough with animals in my time, Mrs. Carter, rougher than I'm proud of. But I never once could have done what that man did. Watching you save something he'd have killed without a second thought, it made me look hard at my own methods, and I didn't much care for what I saw looking back." Emma felt something in her chest loosen, some old wariness finally releasing. "Then I'll take your help, Travis, gladly. We've got 4 days and a great deal of work left to do." The night before the exhibition, Emma couldn't sleep. She found herself back at the pasture fence past midnight, Phantom's silver coat pale and ghostly in the moonlight, and for the first time in months, he wasn't looking toward the house at all. He stood close to the fence, ears pricked toward her, waiting. "Tomorrow," Emma said softly, "everyone's going to see you. Really see you. Not the broken horse Travis used to call you. Not Calloway's failed specimen. Just you. Whatever that turns out to mean to them." Phantom's nose pressed warm against her palm. Patient and trusting. And Emma felt the weight of everything. Daniel's death, her grandmother's secrets, the courtroom. The gunshot wound still faintly visible along his flank. Months of careful, hard-won trust settle into something that felt for the first time in a long while, like readiness rather than fear. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she whispered, "however Judge Faust rules, however the crowd reacts, I need you to know that you already won something no courtroom can take away. You learned to trust again. That's not nothing, Phantom. That might be the whole point of everything my grandmother started." Behind her, footsteps approached, quiet and familiar, and she didn't need to turn to know it was Elias. "Nervous?" he asked, coming to stand beside her at the rail. "Terrified," Emma admitted. "Not for myself, for him. If this goes wrong tomorrow, if he panics in front of that crowd, if Calloway's men do something desperate, then we'll face it together," Elias said simply. "Same as we've faced everything else since that first night I found you sitting at this very fence, refusing to let your aunt drag you back inside." He glanced at her, something warm and steady in his expression, despite the late hour and the weight of tomorrow hanging over both of them. "I meant what I said before, Emma. Whatever comes of tomorrow, I'm not going anywhere." Emma looked at him for a long moment, at the quiet steadiness that had carried her through weeks of fear and uncertainty, and found herself for the first time since Daniel's death reaching for something that wasn't grief at all. "Neither am I," she said softly, and let her hand find his on the fence rail, and neither of them pulled away. Above them, the window of Isabella's old room stood dark and silent. No longer a source of mystery or mourning, and somewhere behind them Phantom exhaled long and slow into the warm summer night at peace, at last waiting only for the dawn. The exhibition grounds were already crowded by the time Emma led Phantom off the wagon ramp, and the noise alone nearly undid 3 months of careful patient work in a single instant. He froze, ears pinned, nostrils flaring wide, at the press of strangers, the shouting auctioneers, the clatter of tack and wagon wheels on every side. "Easy," Emma murmured, laying her palm flat against his neck the way she had 100 times before. "Easy. I'm right here. Mrs. Carter." A man in a fine gray suit approached clipboard in hand, his eyes moving over Phantom with the practiced assessing gaze of someone who'd judged 1,000 horses before this one. "You're entered for the Trust Demonstration Unusual category. We don't get many requests for it." "We are," Emma said. "You understand the judging panel includes 3 members this year. Myself, Colonel Whitfield of the Territorial Cavalry, and—" He hesitated, glancing down at his clipboard like the name itself might cause trouble. "Mr. Silas Calloway, as a recognized breeding authority." Emma's stomach dropped straight through the ground. "Calloway is judging. He's a respected name in horse breeding circles, ma'am. I understand there's some dispute between your families, but the exhibition board felt his expertise outweighed any personal—" "He tried to have this horse killed 3 weeks ago," Emma said, her voice low and furious. "He shot him in the dark of night on my own property. There's a legal appeal pending in Cheyenne this very week over who rightfully owns him." The man's face paled slightly. Ma'am, I wasn't aware of the particulars. The board simply saw his name and his credentials and—" "It doesn't matter," Elias said, stepping up beside Emma, his voice calm despite the tension radiating off him. "Let him judge. Let him sit up there and watch what his own cruelty couldn't produce in 15 years of breeding. There's no better witness against him than his own eyes." Emma looked at Elias, drawing strength from his steadiness, and nodded slow. "Fine. Let him judge. Let the whole territory see exactly what kind of man he is when the truth is standing in the middle of that arena, unable to be bought or dismissed." They had 2 hours before the demonstration, and Emma spent every minute of it at Phantom's side, murmuring low and constant, letting him settle bit by bit into the chaos around him. Margaret arrived just past noon, having ridden hard from the ranch with news that made Emma's chest go tight with fresh dread. "There's a rider come from Cheyenne," Margaret said, breathless, pressing a folded letter into Emma's hands. "Judge Faust has scheduled his ruling for tomorrow morning. Calloway's lawyer petitioned to have it moved up, said the matter needed swift resolution before, and I quote, 'Further public spectacle muddies clear legal fact.' He's trying to rule before anyone sees what happens here today," Elias said grimly. "Then we make sure what happens here today can't be undone by any ruling tomorrow," Emma said, though her hands had started to shake, the weight of everything pressing down harder now that the hour had nearly come. "Where's Judge Priest's statement? Did it arrive?" "Here." Margaret pulled a second letter from her satchel, this one bearing an official territorial seal. "Delivered to the exhibition board this morning, addressed directly to Judge Faust with instructions that it be read into record before any ruling is finalized." Elias scanned it fast, his expression easing slightly with relief. "She's urging Faust to withhold judgment until he's reviewed testimony from today's demonstration, arguing that public evidence of the animal's temperament bears directly on the cruelty allegations against Calloway's operation." He looked up at Emma. "It's not a guarantee, but it's a delay, and it's leverage. If we can show this crowd, this panel, exactly what that horse is capable of, then we'd better not fail," Emma said, and turned back to Phantom, whose ears had swiveled toward her voice, steady now despite the noise and chaos still swirling around them. Josiah Reed found them an hour before the demonstration, hobbling on a cane Elias had fashioned him back at the ranch, his burned arm still wrapped, but healing well. "Wasn't sure I'd make it in time," he said, breathless. "Rode most the night. Wanted to see him. Wanted to see what came of that colt I couldn't drown 20 years back." Emma felt her throat tighten. "You're just in time, Mr. Reed. Come look at him." Josiah approached the fence, slow, careful, and Phantom's head, lifted ears, pricking toward the old man, with an alertness that made Emma's breath catch. Not fear, not the wariness he showed strangers, but something closer to recognition, though she knew that couldn't be possible. Not truly. Not after 20 years in a creek bed he'd been barely 3 days old to remember. "Hey there," Josiah said, voice cracking. "Hey fella, look at you. Look at what you grew into." Phantom stretched his neck forward, nose working the air, and then slow and deliberate closed the distance and pressed his muzzle against the old man's shoulder, exactly the way he'd done with Emma, That first tender night of trust. Josiah's composure broke entirely. He wrapped one trembling arm around the horse's neck, tears streaming freely down his weathered face, and Emma had to look away, her own eyes stinging, giving the old man his moment of long overdue grace. 20 years, Josiah whispered into Phantom's mane. 20 years I wondered if I did right or wrong leaving you breathing in that mud. Look at you now. Ain't a doubt left in my mind. The arena. When they finally led Phantom through the gate, seemed to swallow all the air from Emma's lungs at once. Hundreds of faces lined the fence, murmuring, craning for a look at the horse whose story had apparently already begun spreading through the exhibition grounds. The widow, the rescued colt, the courtroom battle in Cheyenne, all of it whispered mouth to mouth until Emma could hear fragments of her own story reflected back at her from strangers' lips. At the center of the arena stood a raised platform where the three judges sat. Colonel Whitfield stern and upright in his cavalry blues. The man in the gray suit clipboard balanced on his knee. And Silas Calloway composed once more his earlier fury. From the courthouse steps replaced now with something colder, more calculating. His eyes fixed hard on Phantom as Emma led him into the open arena. "Mrs. Carter," Calloway called out, his voice carrying clean across the hushed crowd, pitched for effect. "I confess, I'm curious to see what exactly you intend to demonstrate. This animal has never once to my knowledge accepted saddle or bridle in his entire life. What precisely are we here to judge?" Emma stopped at the center of the arena, Phantom standing close beside her, his sides trembling faintly at the crowd's pressing attention, but his eyes fixed steady on her, waiting. "You're here to judge trust, Mr. Calloway," Emma said loud enough that her voice carried too steady despite the thunder of her own heartbeat. "The very thing your operation spent 15 years trying to breed and never once managed to produce because you tried to force it instead of earning it." A ripple of murmurs swept the crowd. Calloway's jaw tightened visibly even from a distance. "Bold claims for an unbroken animal standing in the middle of a public arena," he said. "I'd remind you, ma'am, that this demonstration is being weighed as evidence in a legal matter still pending before this territory's courts." "I'm aware," Emma said, and reached up to unclip Phantom's lead rope entirely, letting it fall away into the dirt. The crowd gasped audibly. Even Colonel Whitfield leaned forward in his seat, brow furrowed with sudden sharp interest. "No rope," Emma said, stepping back from Phantom, her hands empty, her heart hammering so hard she thought the whole arena must surely hear it. "No bridle, no force of any kind, just him and me, and whatever trust 3 months of patience managed to build between us." She turned to face Phantom fully, and for one terrible, endless moment, the horse simply stood there, ears swiveling toward the crowd's murmuring noise, his weight shifting nervous and uncertain across all 4 legs. Emma's heart clenched. If he bolted now, if the crowd's pressing chaos proved too much, everything, the courtroom victory, the exhibition's evidence, Judge Priest's careful letter, all of it would collapse into nothing more than a widow's foolish public spectacle. "Come here," Emma said softly, holding out her hand, palm up the way she had that very first frightened night at the pasture fence. "Come here, Phantom. Show them." The silence stretched unbearable. Then slow and deliberate. Phantom took a single step toward her. The crowd's murmur died to absolute silence. He took another step, then another, his gait steadying with each stride until he crossed the last few feet at something close to a trot and pressed his nose firm against Emma's outstretched palm, exactly as he had 100 times before in the quiet privacy of the pasture, only now before hundreds of watching strangers. The arena erupted into stunned, scattered applause. "That's not training," Colonel Whitfield said loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear, leaning forward with something like genuine astonishment. "That's not any method I've seen in 30 years of cavalry service. That animal came to her like he'd choose her over every other soul on this earth." "He did," Emma said, turning to face the panel fully, now one hand still resting against Phantom's neck. "Because that's exactly what trust looks like when nobody breaks it out of an animal by force. It doesn't come from ropes or fear or a ledger marking which foals are worth keeping alive. It comes from patience. from choosing kindness even when it costs you something. My grandmother understood that 15 years before Mr. Calloway ever wrote a single breeding theory into his precious ledgers, and she proved it by saving a 3-day-old colt he'd already marked for death. Calloway shot to his feet on the judge's platform, his composure finally fully cracking apart in front of the entire watching crowd. "This is theater," he snapped. "Nothing more than a widow's sentimental performance, dressed up as science. Sit down, Mr. Calloway." Colonel Whitfield said, his voice cutting sharp and commanding across the arena. "I have commanded cavalry horses my entire career, and I have never once in 30 years seen an unbroken animal choose a human being over an arena full of strangers without a single rope or command compelling him to do so. Whatever this is, it is not theater. Sit down and let the demonstration continue." Calloway sat jaw-clenched, white with fury, and Emma felt something fierce and triumphant blaze up in her chest. "Watch," she said to the crowd, to the judges, to Calloway most of all, and stepped back several paces, opening the distance between herself and Phantom once more. "Come," she called soft, and he came again. Unhesitating this time, crossing the space between them at an easy trot that drew fresh gasps from the crowd. She turned, walked a slow half-circle, and he followed, matching her pace exactly, his head turned toward her the entire time like nothing else in that crowded arena existed at all. "Stop," she said, and he stopped. "Stay," she said, backing away 10 full paces, 20. And he stood rooted, trembling faintly with the effort of the crowd's pressing noise, but holding his ground, waiting for her word. "Come," she called again, and he ran to her full and unrestrained, closing the distance in a handful of powerful strides, and pressing his nose hard against her chest. And the crowd's applause. This time came thunderous, unrestrained hundreds of hands clapping and voices calling out in astonishment at what they'd just witnessed. Emma wrapped both arms around Phantom's neck, tears slipping free at last, and over his shoulder she caught sight of Josiah Reed in the crowd weeping openly, and Margaret beside him with one hand pressed hard against her chest, and Elias watching with an expression that held every bit of pride and love Emma had ever hoped to see directed at her in her whole life. The judges deliberated for nearly 20 minutes, the crowd restless and murmuring throughout before Colonel Whitfield rose to deliver the panel's verdict. In 30 years of military service, he began, his voice carrying clean and strong across the hushed arena, "I have evaluated a great many horses for temperament, discipline, and trainability. I have never once witnessed a demonstration that so thoroughly redefined what those words ought to mean." He glanced toward Calloway, seated rigid and silent beside him. "This panel awards its highest recognition to Mrs. Emma Carter and the horse known as Phantom, not merely for skill, but for demonstrating a truth. This territory badly needs reminding of that the finest qualities in any creature, human or animal, cannot be forced into being. They must be earned through patience, through kindness, and through a willingness to be trusted rather than feared." The crowd's applause rose thunderous once more, and Emma felt Margaret's arms close around her. From one side, Elias's steady hand finding hers from the other, the whole overwhelming weight of the past 3 months finally blessedly beginning to lift. But it was the second judge, the man in the gray suit, who spoke next, his voice carrying a formality that made Emma's stomach clench with fresh nerves. "This panel's finding," he said, "along with the sworn testimony already before Judge Priest's court and Judge Priest's own written statement submitted this morning, will be forwarded immediately to Judge Faust's chambers in Cheyenne, with this panel's strong recommendation that today's demonstration be weighed as material evidence in the matter of ownership currently under appeal." Calloway rose from his seat without a word, his face a mask of controlled fury, and descended from the platform, cutting a path straight toward Emma through the still applauding crowd. "You've won nothing," he said, low and venomous, stopping close enough that only Emma, Elias, and Margaret could hear him clearly over the crowd's noise. "A parlor trick performed for an easily impressed audience changes nothing about the legal facts of ownership, Mrs. Carter. Judge Faust rules tomorrow, and he owes me considerably more than sentiment." "Maybe," Emma said, steady, despite the tremor still running through her from the demonstration's adrenaline. "Or maybe today, in front of hundreds of witnesses, including a decorated cavalry colonel, you watched the very thing your own breeding operation spent 15 years failing to produce, And you're standing here threatening a widow instead of admitting you lost, because admitting it would mean admitting everything you built your whole life on was wrong." Calloway's face went white. Then red fury and humiliation warring plain across his features in front of the still watching crowd, several of whom had drawn closer, sensing the confrontation, murmuring amongst themselves. "This isn't finished," he said finally low. "It is for you," Josiah Reed said, stepping forward on his cane, his voice carrying surprising strength despite his age and his injuries. "Whatever Judge Faust rules tomorrow, Silas, the whole territory heard my testimony this week, and the whole territory just watched what that horse became, despite everything your operation tried to make of him. You can win a courtroom with a bought judge. You can't win back what everybody standing in this arena today just saw with their own eyes." Calloway looked between them. Emma, Elias, Margaret, Josiah, his fury visibly curdling into something closer to defeat, and without another word, he turned and walked away through the parting crowd. His composure in shreds, his reputation. Emma suspected considerably more damaged than any courtroom ruling could ever repair. Judge Faust's ruling arrived by rider 2 days later, and Emma read it standing in the ranch's kitchen with Margaret and Elias pressed close on either side, her hands trembling so hard the paper shook audibly in the quiet room. In light of sworn testimony, corroborated by physical documentary evidence, and further weighed against public demonstration evidence submitted by the exhibition panel and endorsed by Judge Eleanor Priest, this court finds no sufficient legal basis to overturn the prior ruling. Ownership of the animal known as Phantom is hereby confirmed to rest with the estate of Isabella Carter and her surviving family. Furthermore, this court refers the matter of Silas Calloway's breeding practices to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for full investigation, given the weight of evidence presented regarding systematic cruelty toward animals within his operation. Emma's knees nearly gave out. Margaret caught her, both women laughing and crying at once, and Elias's hand found the small of Emma's back, steadying, warm, entirely certain. "It's over," Emma breathed. "Aunt Margaret, it's actually over." "It's over," Margaret confirmed, tears streaming freely down her face now, without any attempt to hide them. Isabella's promise finally kept. 2 years late, but kept all the same. Bed. Emma found Phantom in the north pasture that evening, standing not at the fence facing the house, not staring up toward that second-story window, the way he had every single night for 2 long years, but simply grazing calm and easy in the golden light of a Wyoming sunset. She climbed the fence and walked toward him slow, and he lifted his head, ears pricking toward her, with the same warm, unhurried welcome he'd shown her every day now for weeks. "It's done," she told him, resting her forehead against his warm neck. "You're safe. Truly, finally safe. Nobody's ever going to hurt you again, and nobody's ever going to look at you and see anything but exactly what you are." Behind her, she heard familiar footsteps and turned to find Elias approaching his hat. In his hands, an expression on his face she hadn't seen from him before, nervous almost in a way that didn't suit his usual steady calm. "Emma," he said, "I've been offered a position. Territorial University studying animal behavior, formerly the kind of work I've only ever managed piecemeal before now. It's a fine opportunity, the sort of thing I've wanted my whole career." Emma's heart clenched sudden and sharp at the thought of him leaving. "That's wonderful, Elias. Truly." "It's in Cheyenne," he said. "Close enough to visit regular if that's something you'd want. Or—" He hesitated, turning his hat over once in his hands, the nervous gesture achingly familiar now after months of watching him work through difficult moments with exactly that same motion. "Or I could decline it. Stay here instead. Help with the ranch, help with him." He nodded toward Phantom. "And see what might grow between us if you're willing to let something grow this soon after everything you've already carried." Emma looked at him for a long, searching moment, at the man who'd ridden into her life the same terrible week she'd buried her husband, who'd stood beside her through courtrooms and gunfire and a horse's slow, hard-won healing, who'd never once asked her to grieve faster or love sooner than felt true to her own heart. "Don't decline it," she said finally, and watched his face fall just slightly before she continued. Take the position, Elias, but take it knowing I'll be here. That this ranch isn't going anywhere, and neither am I, and Cheyenne isn't so far that a man determined enough couldn't visit regular the way you said." She reached for his hand. "I buried my husband 3 months ago, and I loved him, and I'm not ashamed of that love, or in any hurry to pretend it didn't matter. But I've learned something else these past 3 months too, watching that horse learn to trust again after everything that tried to break him. Grief and love aren't opposites, Elias. They can live in the same heart side by side if you let them." Elias's whole face changed relief, and something warmer both blooming across his features at once. "Then I'll take the position," he said, "and I'll ride back to this ranch every chance I get for as long as you'll have me." "I'll have you," Emma said, and meant it fully completely, in a way that surprised her with how easy the words came. The winter exhibition's story spread through the territory faster than any of them expected, carried mouth to mouth through towns and trading posts, until by the following spring, letters began arriving at the Carter Ranch, from strangers who'd heard tell of the widow and her rescued horse, from families hoping to learn Emma's patient methods from other ranchers, questioning the cruelty long accepted as ordinary practice in their own operations, even from a newspaper in Denver, requesting an interview about the courtroom battle and its outcome. Margaret, for her part, found herself transformed by the whole ordeal in ways Emma hadn't fully anticipated. The stern, exhausted woman who'd once wanted nothing more than to be rid of a troublesome horse now spent her mornings walking the pasture herself, learning slowly what patience could build, where force had only ever failed. "Your grandmother would hardly recognize me," Margaret said one morning, watching Emma work with a new arrival to the ranch, a young mare timid and mistrustful, sent by a rancher 2 counties over who'd heard of Emma's growing reputation. "I spent 2 years angry at a dead woman's secrets, and now here I am defending her methods to anyone who'll listen." "I think she'd recognize you exactly," Emma said, not looking up from her slow, patient work with the mare. "I think this is exactly what she always hoped we'd become if we just gave ourselves time enough to understand what she was trying to teach us." Travis Boone stayed on at the ranch too. His rough methods gradually softened under months of watching Emma's patient work, until the man who'd once called Phantom useless found himself improbably one of the gentlest hands on the property when it came to the frightened, difficult animals nobody else wanted to take on. "Never thought I'd say this," he admitted to Emma one evening, watching Phantom graze easy and content in the golden pasture light. "But I reckon I owe that horse my thanks much as I ever doubted him. Taught me more about handling a scared animal than 30 years of breaking ever did." "He taught all of us something," Emma said, in his own way. Josiah Reed passed the following winter, peaceful in his sleep, in a small cabin Margaret had insisted on building for him on the edge of the Carter property, close enough that he'd spent his final months watching Phantom graze from his own front porch every single morning. "Man died easy," Hank told Emma when word came. "Sat down in his chair after breakfast, said he was going to rest his eyes a spell, and just didn't wake up. Peaceful as anybody I ever saw go." Emma wept for him at the small service they held on the ranch, standing beside the grave they dug near the old spring house where Isabella's secrets had first come to light, and found some strange comfort in the thought that 2 people who'd both spent decades carrying a shared painful secret had finally, in these last years, found their way to peace with it together. Phantom stood at the fence during the whole of the burial, quiet and still, and when the small crowd finally dispersed, Emma noticed he lingered there a long while after his head bowed low toward the fresh-turned earth, exactly the way he'd once bowed toward a window that no longer held any grief for him at all. 3 years passed, each one gentler than the last. The ranch prospered under Margaret's steady management and Emma's growing reputation as a horsewoman whose methods drew visitors from across the territory, eager to learn what patience and understanding could accomplish where cruelty had only ever failed. Elias divided his time between his university work in Cheyenne and long stretches at the ranch until the visits grew frequent enough, and the distance between them thin enough that a wedding felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability neither of them had ever seriously doubted. They married in the spring, in the very pasture where Phantom had first learned to trust again, Margaret weeping openly through the entire ceremony. Travis standing solemn at the back in his best clothes, and Phantom himself standing close at the fence line throughout, as though he understood, in whatever way horses understand such things, that he was witnessing something sacred. Emma thought of Daniel that day gently, without the sharp ache that had once accompanied every memory of him. She thought of how he would have wanted her to find this eventually not a replacement for what they'd shared, but a continuation of the same capacity for love that had never once run dry inside her, no matter how deep her grief had carved. That evening, standing at the pasture fence in her wedding dress, Elias's hand warm in hers, Emma watched Phantom graze easy beneath a sky gone gold and violet with the setting summer sun, and felt for the first time since she'd buried her husband beneath soft dirt, on a morning that felt a lifetime removed from this one, a peace so complete it settled into her bones like something permanent. The window of Isabella Carter's old room stood open now, curtains drawn back, sunlight pouring freely into a space that had once held nothing but locked grief and silent secrets. Margaret had taken to sleeping there herself in recent months, saying she felt closer to her sister within those walls than she ever had standing outside them in fear. And Phantom no longer looked toward that window at all, not once, not ever again. He had no need to. The past that had once called to him nightly across 2 long years of mourning had finally fully released its hold, replaced by a present built on trust, on patience, on the simple, unshakable truth that some bonds once earned honestly could never again be broken by fear or force or cruelty. He was home. Truly, completely home in every sense that mattered, not merely a place, but a belonging, hard-won and permanent, exactly as Isabella Carter had always believed he deserved, and Emma Carter, standing in the golden light of her wedding day, surrounded by a family built from grief, transformed into love. Understood at last the full weight of what her grandmother's journal had promised her from the very beginning. That the truth, however long it took to surface, however many secrets and dangers stood between a person and their healing, was always worth the patience it demanded. Some horses stare at windows because they are waiting for someone to understand them, and sometimes, if you are patient enough, if you are brave enough to sit quietly at the fence and simply listen, that understanding changes not only the horse, but everyone lucky enough to witness it. Phantom never looked back at that window again. He didn't need to. He had found something better than the past. He had found home.